Hey everyone, Benny's dad here, and back with another video after a tumultuous week in the market. Here to talk about tariff proofing your portfolio. So I know this week was really rocky in the markets. If you've been paying attention like I have, not too much to be overly over the moon, especially at the end of the quarter being down so much into correction territory, NASDAQ being into bear market territory. And with President Trump announcing his tariff plan this week, sending the market into a downward spiral, I thought it was appropriate just to make a video regarding how to take advantage of the overall scene, how I'm looking at it, and ultimately, how to create a strategy around what's going on from a global macroeconomic environment. So I put together just a short presentation on tariffs that we'll go through. And then at the very end, I'll also just talk about, some of the companies that I'm looking at investing into over the course of 2025 that have been really strong performers year to date. And that should continue to kind of follow this guise of being tariff proof. So without further ado, share my screen here and we will get into today's presentation. What's going on? There we go. All right, so what are tariffs? So tariffs are actually just taxes that are imposed on imported goods. And tariffs have been around for centuries, and they're nothing new. We've had tariffs on various goods. Other countries definitely have tariffs as well. Basically, if a product is shipped across any border, the government wants to receive some type of benefit for bringing, foreign goods in and sending our domestic dollars out of our supply. And in so, they impose tariffs as a taxation on these goods to obviously have a benefit for the dollars leaving the economy. So that's why tariffs exist in the first place. If you've ever shipped anything as a small business to an international customer, part of that shipping process is for the customs broker to collect duties and taxes can easily be interchanged with the word tariff in any place that you see it. But essentially, a tariff is just a tax, and so they are taxing imported goods from these various countries at a much higher level than previously done. So, and what that does is it actually increases the cost of bringing in foreign products in an effort to make domestic products more attractive and stimulate the economy for domestic suppliers, right? So, just to give you an example to think about, if I was a, maker of stools and I had to source my lumber from a US forest, I would have to pay a company that obviously charges a federal minimum wage. So their labor costs are higher. My transportation costs wouldn't be so high because obviously domestically it'd be a shorter distance to transport it. I can likely find, a truckload or a trucking company to move it short range for me, bring in all those goods, make it, and then ship it out. Versus if I was making those same stools with foreign lumber, or let's take aluminum for a fact. China supplies a huge amount of our aluminum, and they're getting hit with one of the big tariffs, or have been hit with the rounds of tariffs. But if I make my chairs out of a foreign aluminum, well, the labor that goes into producing that aluminum is cheaper. And even though I may be paying more for transportation, my overall cost of goods is lower because these countries around the world don't have the same laws and stipulations that we do in the States regarding a working livable wage, and in so can make the product much cheaper for us to import. Now the downside of that is obviously we're sending dollars out of our economy, so that means we're stimulating other economies with our dollars and only receiving goods, and that creates a deficit because obviously if the dollars are not getting stimulated in our economy, the dollars that are received by these foreign companies are then being spent to build and construct the foreign companies, which is less attractive for us in the United States because we don't get to benefit. Same as if I was that same wood shop owner and I lived in the States and sold all my product in the States and used that money to buy my groceries, build my house, pay for my kids' college, all of that stuff here in the States. Those dollars would continue to circulate in our economy and produce more goods and more GDP and all that stuff. But if I send those dollars to my Chinese aluminum supplier, my Chinese lumber supplier, well, then those dollars leave the economy and they don't get spent here producing goods and services and continuing the cycle going. So now we have dollars leaving, and are left with only these goods here. So that's the overall underlying issue behind why the trade deficit is being attacked the way that it is. And ultimately, the goal of these tariffs is to raise the cost of foreign goods to the point where that domestic industries now have a better chance to provide their goods and services versus the foreign competitors. And those dollars can stay stimulated and circulating in our own economy. So that's what tariffs are. And that's the first level thinking logic of what these tariffs will do. Now, will that actually work to keep domestic production here in the United States and force consumers to buy things here in the States? That's left up for debate. I'm not really going to, have a crystal ball opinion on what that actually does for our US economy and what the impact of these tariffs will be. I'm just kind of explaining the reasoning logic as one might see the benefit of these tariffs being. So just wanted to throw that out there for everyone as kind of like a baseline of what are these tariffs. Now, tariffs raise the cost of imported goods. I'm kind of going in the same thing here, which can also lower profit margins for companies that rely on them. So if we talk about how these tariffs are specifically going to impact the stocks in your portfolio, well, if you add an additional tax to my cost of goods, you are essentially just increasing my costs. You're shrinking my margins if I choose to keep my prices at the same. Or if I have pricing power, I can pass along those costs to my customers, which ultimately hurts my consumers if I don't make any changes of my supply chain and just keep my costs raised because of the new tariff and that I have to introduce into my cost analysis. So that leads to a reduced competitiveness, right? Because now everyone's costs are doing higher. If you have a big company that has a wide profit margin and they're able to absorb these costs at a much better level than, say, a mom and pop shop who is not able to, raise costs on their customers without losing them to competition and shrink their margins, then, we could have some competitors just completely fall out of the marketplace. We'd also can see some supply chain disruptions, and the thought of retaliatory tariffs can also lead to the overall companies performing not as well as they had, right? Like earnings are impacted, revenues might be the same, if not even raised, because these costs are now built into their product prices, but their overall health of the company is worsened because now they're having to deal with these costs. So that's the potential impact, on specifically on stocks. And this also leads into the next slide. So, and goes into what we're seeing today. So because the tariffs were imposed, we're starting to see stock prices decline. And basically, investors are anticipating that profits will be lower across the board. So, imagine any guidance that was given at the end of 2024 or even in Q1 about, the future state of the company. You're going to see lower profits just overall, right? And if companies aren't profiting as much, they're not as attractive, which causes less people to buy them, sentiment shifts, and becomes less bullish. So investors are trying to get out before that happens because the market is a forward-looking mechanism. So we're already seeing the market volatility pick up, and especially for those companies that either have a global footprint in terms of products. Think about, your Nikes that just shifted all of their manufacturing to Vietnam just for Vietnam to get hit with a 90% tariff. And they make all their products overseas where they are cheap and then import them and distribute them. So we're really concerned with companies that import their goods, and we're also concerned with product-based companies that sell globally that may not be able to import as much. And then when they sell globally, if retaliatory tariffs impact their ability to sell in other countries as well, overall lower revenues and shrunken profit margins will impact the stock prices. So that's all the bad that has to do with this whole tariff scenario. And I know it's not really like sunshine and rainbows talking about, oh man, like this is going to happen, profits are going to be lower, like companies are expecting to make less, and we see the stock market go sideways. Like, trust me, nobody really wants that. Everybody pretty much wants to look for a reason the stock market to go higher, whether that's the Fed cutting interest rates, companies continuing to do better, and overall the health of the economy, the consumer, people spending more, things of that nature. So tariffs kind of seem counterintuitive to all that. But I believe where this administration is headed is that they want to make companies have to choose between sourcing domestically or paying into revenues to clear up the kind of debt imbalance that we've had in this country for a really, really long time. So you saw the Doge, government efficiency kind of movement with Elon try and slash spending. And then now they're moving into ways to creatively generate more revenues, which would be tariffs for the government, right? Because the same thing with your own personal finances, right? If you're in debt and you have a low net worth, at least financial statements, the only two things you can do is make more and cut expenses. Well, the government as a business is kind of the same thing, right? Like we do have these welfare programs and defense and roads and everything else that our taxes pay for as expenses. And we can only cut those so much, right? Like we can't really cut roads or Social Security or even military up to a certain point. Can't really cut those things. So the only real true way forward is to generate more revenues. And that could either be an increase in taxes, which many constituents feel as though we already pay too much for taxes. And even today, a Republican bill was introduced to tax those that make over $1 million at a higher rate to kind of offset some of the continuation of the tax cuts that are set to expire after this year. And the other alternative is to tax goods, right, instead of the constituents and their income. So, they're pulling these levers to try to increase the overall financial health of the government, even at the detriment of the companies and consumers ultimately, because they're the ones that will be impacted by the higher cost of goods. Sorry, I lost my train of thought for a second. So when I'm thinking about that and I'm thinking about my portfolio and stocks to invest in, I want to kind of think of companies that are tariff proof, right? Now that we've explained the tariff situation, how can it impact stock prices? How can it impact companies overall? How can it impact consumers overall? For every company that is impacted and does have a global supply chain, there's also companies that don't get impacted by these tariffs. And some of the traits of those companies are as follows, right? So they have a domestic supply chain. So the companies with domestic supply chains, they're just less exposed, right? They're not importing anything. So go back to my example of the chair maker. If he's sourcing his wood, lumber, or aluminum here in the United States, well, then he's not going to get hit with tariffs. Granted, if his supplier is sourcing it, then it's a domino effect and it's too removed. But at least at the local level, for any lumber companies that are doing there, they will see more business if they're sourcing their product and materials here in the United States. The second thing that is kind of tariff proof, at least for the company's benefit, if not for the consumers, is the ability of pricing power. Like pricing power is your ability to basically just pass your costs on to consumers. And you should think of goods that are, essential and necessary as having strong pricing power, right? Like water, right? Water, well, we don't import water, at least I hope we don't import water. I'd have to look into the supply chain of all the water that we get. But, if we do import water, like water is absolutely essential to life. So if your gallon of water goes from $1 to $10 to $20 per gallon, there's not really much that you can do about that. And the company can just force you to pay that. You could also think of it, your utilities, right? Your utilities have pricing power. Whether it's your trash pickup, your internet, your phone bill, your anything like that, all of those people. Now, there's some switching ability, especially like telecommunications, right? I can go from Sprint to Verizon to T-Mobile to AT&T, whatever. But when it comes to my trash pickup for my local trash people, I only have one option here in my city. Most people do. So they have strong pricing power to basically just increase their rates as their expenses go up. And there's many companies like that provide an essential and necessary product, and ultimately can dictate what the cost is because they don't have many competitors, or they're just completely essential and necessary. Moving on, you also have, obviously low import numbers kind of directly ties to domestic supply chains, right? If they are importing only a small percentage of the goods, then of course they're going to be less impacted by tariffs. And then the last thing would be those businesses with contract business, right? Especially a long-term contract business. If you have a company that is in something like a mortgage per se, a 30-year mortgage, right? Like that's pretty much set in stone. Now the obviously the mortgage, the house that the mortgage is on can be sold, the debt paid in full, and a new mortgage opened for whoever's buying it. But that's a 30-year contract that likely isn't going to change unless, assuming it's a fixed rate loan. But, there's many contracts across the course of business that will be left in place to continue to have the business going on. So any industry that thrives on contract business, they may be able to pass their increased costs onto the consumer. But at the very least, they'll be able to maintain that business for a long period of time because they are under contract. So those are some of the traits of a tariff-proof company, like domestic supply chains, contract business, pricing power, low import numbers, and ultimately like essential and necessary business. So hopefully your wheels are already turning into some ideas of what companies that those could be. As we move on to the next slide here. But some of the sectors, just to give you an idea, that are, those essential, necessary, and low import, kind of meets all those characteristics. I've already mentioned a couple: utilities, healthcare, telecommunications, regional banks, right? Not banks that deal in global trade and transaction and currency exchange, but more so like your regional banks that just deal with your everyday local consumer personal loans, those more auto loans, things of that nature. Real estate to a certain degree, and then the consumer staples. So think of your Colgate Palmolives, your Waste Management, Costco, Walmart, basically your discount retailers like Kroger, Dollar Tree, Dollar General, all of those places where as consumers are feeling the pinch of rising costs, will look to these kind of de facto cheaper areas to get the same goods and trade down to a lower tiered item, just in order to try to beat some of the inflationary cause of tariffs. So I put real estate in here because obviously for new home builds that source lumber outside of the country, like those prices will definitely be impacted. I think I saw a statistic that said between like $25,000 and $45,000 per house would be impacted by the rising lumber costs. So definitely not any like new building of housing. because obviously building materials is going to get hit pretty hard. But housing itself might not be impacted as much, because if you can imagine the cost of goods getting higher, there's going to be less discretionary income. There's going to be less ability for people to just go out and purchase a house, or they might think twice about purchasing a house as they continue to kind of squirrel away money. So you're going to get less competition for houses, which is actually shifts the market from a seller's market to a buyer's market in a sense. Now, there may not be the supply to necessarily have that happen. But as far as demand goes, when you get lower demand because costs of living have gone up, making more houses unaffordable for most people, you're going to get a ton of demand on what would be considered maybe like starter homes, single family homes, your very small units, you're on the lower end of your spectrum. But on the higher end, you're definitely going to have less demand, which is going to create an opportunity to get housing at a lower cost. Now, if the tariff situation causes mass unemployment and a slashing in interest rates, and we see mortgage, that's a whole nother topic for a whole nother video. The main important thing is to focus on these particular industries: utilities, healthcare, telecommunications, regional banks, and consumer staples, to really narrow down some stocks that you can add to your portfolio to increase the likelihood of generating alpha or returns that are higher than just your typical S&P 500 returns. So just to demonstrate on how to do that, I have a handy dandy website here called FinViz that I like to use to look at stocks that meet a particular criteria that could be interesting purchases, right? So both of these companies are fairly down on the year in Constellation Energy Corporation and Vistra Corporation, but they're two utilities that meet certain profitability metrics that I really like. So there's two ideas for you to add to your watch list. If we go over to the consumer defensive, which is very similar as consumer staples, we see companies like Coca-Cola, Monster, Kellanova, Colgate, Palmolive, Pepsi, Hershey, Clorox. These are your staples that will, not benefit, but basically consumers can't go without these products. So they have that pricing power, they have that essentialness, they have that necessity. And some of them even have domestic supply chains, like Procter & Gamble, manufactures a lot of its goods here in California, where I'm based out of. So that's consumer defensive. If we click over to real estate, a lot of real estate stocks don't meet my particular criteria. But we could see that this American Tower Corp has performed very well throughout the course of, Q1 2025, as we see other stocks, not do as well. So I would definitely encourage you to play around in your FinViz and create your own criteria for, coming up with stocks that are beneficial for your particular portfolio. Some ones that I'm heavily investing in and putting my money into would be Costco, Netflix, Waste Management. Those are probably my top three that would not be impacted by the tariffs as much as potentially other companies, and present some really good opportunity to increase the gains of your portfolio. And so I'll just wrap with this thought, is that if you are thinking of what you should do to change your investment strategy, part of it is nothing. Part of it is nothing. Don't change anything. Everything that I've just presented for the last 25 minutes is for the investor that wants to pick stocks as a hobby or something like that, or just has some interest in it. But if you're dollar cost averaging into the S&P 500 as your primary form of investing, as I do with my retirement accounts, like my 401k, continue to do that. The benefit of dollar cost averaging is that you add at the lows as things continue to lower. And then the drawback is you add at the highs. So you spent all of 2024 adding at the highs as you're DCAing. So now that things are starting to rebound and come down, it really behooves you to continue to add so that when you are finally back at the highs, you have even more shares. So if you're dollar cost averaging, continue to do that. You could also stockpile some cash in the hopes that you can time the bottom, but that's very hard to do. Or you can pile into some of these stocks and sectors that I've suggested throughout the course of the video, so that you have a potential to generate some alpha against the S&P 500 losses. And I'm curious to see, what do you think you're going to do for the rest of the year with your portfolio? Are you adding individual stocks? Of the ones that I've mentioned in the sectors, are you invested in any? Costco, Waste Management, and Netflix are the top three that I'm investing in 2025, as I think they'll be pretty tariff proof, and they've already proven themselves as strong companies. But what are you investing? Let me know in the comments. Please like and subscribe, and we'll catch you guys next week.